"Sorry, but the cleaning staff enters through the back door," said the blonde receptionist, without even looking up from her computer as she pointed me toward the side hallway of the corporate building. It was 7:30 a.m. on Monday morning, and I was standing at the main entrance of Meridian Holdings, clutching my executive briefcase and wearing my best Italian suit. "Actually, I'm here for a meeting on the 30th floor," I replied calmly, watching her expression of surprise when she finally looked me straight in the eye. She blinked a few times, clearly processing the information that a well-dressed 34-year-old black man was not there to clean bathrooms. "Oh, do you have an appointment?" she asked, now with a slightly less condescending tone, but still laden with skepticism. My name is Daniel, and at that moment, as I showed her my temporary corporate ID, I knew exactly what was going through her mind. Over the past 15 years of building my career in finance, from junior analyst to executive director, I've learned to recognize that look. The look of someone who automatically assumes that my presence there must be a mistake. But this time was different. Very different. Because today wasn't just another day of facing racial microaggressions in board meetings or subtle comments about diversity at corporate happy hours. Today I was taking over as CEO of the company. And absolutely no one at Meridian Holdings knew it yet. The official announcement would be made at 9 a.m., but I had arrived early to observe. To understand exactly how I would be received before they knew who I really was. "Mr. Daniel Thompson for a meeting with the board," she said on the phone, still watching me suspiciously. "Yes, he says he has a meeting on the 30th floor. What do you mean, he's the new?" I saw the exact moment when it dawned on her. Her eyes widened, the phone almost slipped from her hand, and an expression of utter panic took over her face. I'm so sorry, Mr. Thompson. I didn't know you were," she stammered, rising abruptly from her chair. "Don't worry," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "It happens more than you think." As I waited for the elevator, I reflected on how many times similar situations had happened throughout my career. How many times I had to prove that I belonged in the spaces I occupied, simply because of the color of my skin. But today would be different. Today, I wasn't just walking into another meeting room as a tolerated racial minority. Today I was taking control. The elevator arrived, and as the doors closed, I couldn't help but smile a little. If that was just the receptionist, I could hardly imagine the reactions that awaited me upstairs. Especially when they found out that the diversity problem they discussed so much in their executive meetings was now, literally, their boss. If you're enjoying this corporate twist story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how this racial mess turned into the most epic lesson these executives ever received. Because when the doors to the 30th floor opened, I knew I was about to witness something that would forever change the racial dynamics of that company. The elevator doors opened to the 30th floor, revealing a corporate luxury environment that I knew well from other companies. Imported marble, glass panels, and the typical silence of executive power hanging like an invisible fog. But what really caught my attention was the conversation I heard coming from the main conference room, their voices echoing down the empty hallway. "This diversity thing is getting ridiculous. Now they're going to force us to hire a black CEO." The voice belonged to Richard Blackstone, the CFO, whose background I had studied meticulously over the past few weeks. "At least it's temporary," replied a female voice I recognized as Jennifer Walsh, Chief Operating Officer. 2 years max, and we can reverse this stupid decision by the board. They'll realize their mistake." I stopped strategically near the half-open door, invisible to them but able to hear every venomous word coming out of her mouths. "The board is bowing to outside pressure. Pure diversity washing," Richard continued, and I could picture his cynical smile. "I bet he doesn't even have any real experience for the job. He probably got here through quotas, as always happens with these types." Jennifer laughed cruelly, a sound that made me grind my teeth. "Well, at least she'll be easy to control. These types are usually too grateful for the opportunity to cause any real trouble. They keep quiet, do what we tell them, and everyone's happy." "What if she doesn't?" asked a third voice, which I identified as Tom Bradley, Director of Human Resources. "Simple," Richard replied with a confidence that made me clench my fists involuntarily. "We make his life impossible. We question every decision publicly, undermine his authority in meetings, create passive resistance in every department. In 6 months, he asks for his resignation for personal reasons, and we'll be back to normal." Exactly. It worked perfectly with the last diversity director they tried to shove down our throats, Jennifer added with cruel enthusiasm. Remember Martin Washington? He lasted exactly 4 months. He left crying about a toxic environment and lack of support. They laughed like hyenas, sharing an inside joke. The key is to never do anything explicit, Tom explained methodically. Always question from a technical standpoint. Always ask for more data or a second opinion. Always suggest that it might be better to consult someone with more experience in the field. Plain English, always remind him that he doesn't belong here, Richard translated brutally. I took a deep breath, processing not only the conversation, but the casual, almost bored tone with which they discussed systematic racial sabotage. As if it were a routine, tried and tested business strategy. These weren't impulsive comments, inappropriate jokes, or unconscious biases. It was a manual of corporate discrimination. And I had just discovered that I wouldn't be Meridian Holdings' first black CEO. I would also be the #1 target of a well-orchestrated conspiracy to psychologically destroy me before I even sat in the presidential chair. The name is Daniel Thompson, Tom said, leafing through papers with disinterest. Solid experience on his resume, I admit. Double MBA, 15 years in the market, impressive numbers. But you know how it is. These diversity hires always look impressive on paper. In practice, they can't handle the real pressure, Jennifer added. Especially when they discover that they need more than a fancy degree to command real men. Richard laughed harshly. As long as he keeps his mouth shut about cultural changes and that kind of woke progressive nonsense, we can get along. We don't have time for racial sensitivity workshops or lectures on white privilege. Imagine if he came here thinking he could revolutionize something, Jennifer laughed dismissively. As if 30 years of family tradition would change because of a guy who's probably never managed anything bigger than a suburban branch office. Each word was like a poisoned stab, not because of the novelty of the discrimination, but because of the crystal-clear confirmation of suspicions I had harbored for years. During 15 years of a meteoric career, I always knew these conversations were happening behind my back. In executive bathrooms, private dinners at exclusive clubs, golf courses where I would never be invited. But hearing the explicit crudeness, the murderous naturalness with which they planned my professional and personal destruction, touched something much deeper and more powerful than simple anger. It touched nuclear determination. Well, Tom concluded with obvious satisfaction, at least we know exactly what we're dealing with. He won't be the first black puppet, and he certainly won't be the last. The system always corrects itself. As I listened to her confident laughter echoing around the room, I mentally visualized each of his with surgical precision. Richard Blackstone, 52 years old, Harvard graduate with family connections, 20 years with the company. History of discriminatory comments documented in 3 HR cases that were mysteriously closed without merit. Jennifer Walsh, 48 years old, Stanford MBA, 15 years climbing the ladder. Known behind the scenes for systematically questioning the qualifications of black candidates for every executive promotion. Tom Bradley, 55 years old, HR director for 12 endless years. Architect of hiring policies that resulted in less than 3% black executives in a company of 800 employees. They had just handed her, without the slightest awareness, a detailed map of how institutional racism operated at Meridian Holdings. More importantly, they gave me the perfect motivation to not only take on the job with competence, but to completely transform the discriminatory culture he proudly called tradition. They expected a submissive, eternally grateful, and easily controllable black CEO. They were about to get to know Daniel Thompson in full, and discover that underestimating someone solely because of the color of their skin can be the most costly and devastating mistake a company can make. The race war he had planned against me had officially begun. But he didn't know that I was already 3 moves ahead. I took a deep breath and knocked lightly on the conference room door, abruptly interrupting their conspiratorial laughter. "Excuse me," I said, pushing the door open and stepping inside with a confidence that 15 years of executive experience had taught me to project. The silence that followed was almost palpable. 3 white faces stared at me with expressions ranging from confusion to thinly veiled irritation. "Sorry, but this is a private meeting," Richard said automatically, not even bothering to get up from his chair. "If you're looking for the cleaning department." "Actually, I'm looking for you guys," I replied calmly, placing my briefcase on the glass table. "Daniel Thompson, your new CEO." If someone had filmed that moment, they would have captured a masterclass in corporate racial shock. Richard turned pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Jennifer spilled coffee on her expensive blouse, staining the imported silk. Tom simply froze, holding the papers in the air as if he had turned into a statue. We don't. I mean, Jennifer stammered, clearly mentally recalculating every word they had said in the last 10 minutes. Don't worry, I said, sitting down at the head of the table with deliberate slowness. I only heard the last comments about how easy it would be to control me, and the plans to question my decisions until I resigned for personal reasons. Richard tried to regain his composure, but sweat had appeared on his forehead. Mr. Thompson, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We were just discussing strategies for racial sabotage against your new boss? I interrupted softly. No, there was no misunderstanding. It was quite clear. Tom finally found his trembling voice. Look, maybe we can start from scratch. I'm Tom Bradley, HR, and these are Richard Blackstone and Jennifer Walsh. I know who you are. I opened my briefcase and took out 3 files. In fact, I know a lot more about you than you realize. I placed the files on the table, one in front of each of them. Richard, for example. 3 racial discrimination lawsuits filed in 5 years. The last one involving comments about the natural intellectual capacity of black employees during an evaluation meeting. Richard's face turned from white to red. Jennifer, 2 lawsuits for creating a hostile environment for minority employees. Including that interesting case with analyst Keisha Williams, who you said didn't have the right profile to grow in the company. Jennifer swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. And Tom, your hiring policies have resulted in the lowest racial diversity statistics in the entire history of Meridian Holdings. An impressive achievement for someone in human resources. The silence hung heavy. I could almost hear their brains processing the fact that they weren't dealing with the manageable black CEO they had expected. Do you think you got where you are solely on merit? I continued, my voice maintaining its conversational tone. That you never benefited from an exclusively white network? From opportunities systematically denied to people like me? That's not, we never, Jennifer began. You've never what? Never wondered why all the previous CEOs of this company were white men of the same age group? Never questioned why of the last 20 executive promotions, 19 went to white candidates? I stood up slowly, watching as everyone instinctively leaned back in their chairs. But you know what's most interesting? You just gave me exactly what I needed. Richard frowned, confused. What are you talking about? Confirmation. I smiled for the first time since entering the room. For weeks, preparing for this position, I wondered if the stories about institutional racism at Meridian Holdings were exaggerated. If maybe the diversity statistics were just a coincidence. I walked to the window, looking out at the city below. You just confirmed that not only is racism real and systematic, but that you have an operating manual for destroying black executives. In less than 10 minutes, you gave me enough evidence for federal discrimination lawsuits. The color drained completely from Tom's face. You were recording? I don't need to record, Tom. Your own actions over the next few months will be evidence enough. I walked back to the table, gathering my files. Because you won't be able to resist. You'll try exactly what you planned, and I'll be documenting every move. Look, Daniel, Richard tried to strike a conciliatory tone. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot. We can work together. Of course you can. My smile widened. You can start by writing your resignation letters. The shock returned to his faces. Because here's what's going to happen, I continued, putting the files back in my briefcase. You're going to try to implement exactly the plan you discussed. You're going to question my decisions, undermine my authority, create passive resistance. I paused at the door, turning to face them one last time. And when you do that, when you publicly display the racism I just witnessed in private, you won't just lose your jobs. You'll lose your reputations, your networks, your entire careers. Tom swallowed hard. You can't fire us like that. We have contracts, rights. You're right, I agreed cheerfully. I can't fire you arbitrarily. I need just cause. I opened the door, but paused in the doorway. Please give me just cause. As I left the room, I heard the beginning of a desperate discussion between voices whispering urgently about damage control and defensive strategies. He still didn't understand. There was no possible defense against what was coming. Because during 15 years of being underestimated, questioned, and sabotaged because of his color, he learned something they would never imagine: how to turn institutional racism into the very weapon of destruction of those who practice it. And now he had the power to do just that. 3 hours later, I was settled into my new executive office, surrounded by boxes of documents I had urgently requested from the Human Resources Department. Hiring policies from the last 5 years. Diversity reports. Records of executive promotions. Performance reviews of black versus white employees. Each page revealed a pattern so systematic that it was almost artistic in its discriminatory precision. Mr. Thompson? My new assistant, Patricia, a black woman in her 40s, appeared at the door with a cautious expression. Sorry to bother you, but there are some employees who would like to speak with you. Sure, send them in. What I saw next completely surprised me. 7 people entered my office, all black, all with that cautious look of people who have suffered too much in hostile corporate environments. Mr. Thompson, said a tall man in his 50s, I'm Marcus Johnson from accounting. We heard some talk in the hallways about your arrival and... You're concerned about whether I'm really going to change anything or if I'm just another token hire, I finished. The relief was visible on his face. Exactly, said a young woman. I'm Keisha Williams, from marketing. I've seen promises before. I've heard speeches about inclusion. But in the end, you continue to be passed over for promotions, questioned in meetings, and treated as if you're lucky to be here, I finished. Keisha nodded vigorously. Jennifer Walsh once told me I should be more grateful for the opportunity. As if my MBA and my results didn't matter. I got up from my chair and closed the office door. Sit down. Let's have a real conversation. Over the next hour, I heard stories that confirmed every suspicion I had about Meridian Holdings. Comments about unprofessional hair. Constant questioning of competence. Systematic exclusion from important meetings. Racial jokes disguised as corporate humor. What would you do if you had the real power to change this? I asked. Marcus leaned forward. Documentation. Everything needs to be documented. They're smart, they never do anything explicit. But the patterns are there. Exactly, agreed Keisha. And it's not just about hiring more black people. It's about creating an environment where we can thrive, not just survive. When they left 2 hours later, I had something far more valuable than documents. I had an internal network of allies who had mapped every aspect of the company's institutional racism. And he had something he didn't have before, real hope. But my work was just beginning. I called her personal attorney, David Chun, who specializes in corporate law and discrimination. David, I need you to put together a team. We're going to do a full audit of Meridian Holdings' HR practices. Voluntary audit. Or are we laying the groundwork for something bigger? Let's just say I'm being proactive. Very proactive. Next, I contacted my former colleague Sarah Martinez, now a corporate diversity consultant who had transformed 3 Fortune 500 companies in the last 5 years. Daniel, I heard you finally landed a CEO position. How can I help? I need a complete cultural transformation strategy. But not the diplomatic, gradual version. I need the definitive version. Sarah's laughter echoed over the phone. Oh, they really messed with the wrong person, huh? Send me the company data. We're going to create something that will go down in the history books. While waiting for the analyses to arrive, I decided to take a walk through the hallways. I wanted to see how the news of my arrival was spreading. I didn't have to wait long. Passing by the executive lounge, I heard Richard on the phone with someone. I don't know where the board found this guy, but I guarantee he won't last 6 months. We already have strategies in place. Jennifer was in her office with the door ajar, talking to 2 other white executives. Typical diversity CEO. He'll want to implement all these progressive changes, he'll create resistance, and when the numbers start to drop, the board will realize their mistake. Tom Bradley was meeting with other HR directors, discussing openly. The key is to make everything seem performance-related, never race. Question decisions on technical concerns, suggest more experience would be helpful, always keep the tone professional. Every conversation I overheard confirmed my strategy. They wouldn't be able to resist the temptation to implement exactly the plan they had discussed that morning. Racial arrogance was so ingrained that they wouldn't be able to control themselves. And I would be documenting every move. Back in my office, I called my mentor, former CEO James Washington, one of the few black executives who had managed to transform a racist company and hold his position for over a decade. James, the time has come to use everything you taught me. From the sound of your voice, I imagine the reception wasn't the warmest. Worse than that. It was exactly as we expected. He has an operating manual for destroying black CEOs. Audio recordings in meetings. Automatically copied emails. A network of black employees reporting incidents in real time. If you're following this journey of corporate transformation and want to see how someone can turn the tables on institutional racism, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what comes next will completely redefine the concept of justice in the workplace. Because at the end of that first day, while reviewing dozens of documents and recorded conversations, a crystal clear truth emerged. Richard, Jennifer, and Tom would not only fall into the trap he himself had created. They would meticulously document his own professional destruction. And I wouldn't even have to lift a finger beyond doing exactly the job I was hired to do, be the best CEO Meridian Holdings has ever had. The rest would be a natural consequence of those who choose to fight competence using only prejudice as a weapon. 2 weeks later, my plan was in full swing. On the surface, I was the model CEO. I arrived early, attended every meeting, made data-driven decisions, and treated everyone with exemplary professionalism. Behind the scenes, I was documenting the most systematic campaign of racial sabotage I had ever witnessed. The first board meeting was a masterclass in disguised discrimination. "Daniel, your expansion proposal is interesting," Richard began, using exactly the condescending tone I expected. "But perhaps we should consult someone with more experience in the retail sector before making such ambitious decisions." Jennifer immediately chimed in, "I completely agree. Not that we question your ability, of course, but these decisions have long-term consequences that can be complex for someone still adapting to the company." Tom added the finishing touch. "We could form an advisory committee. People with more history in the company could guide the initial strategies." In plain English, 3 white executives had just publicly suggested that the black CEO needed supervision because he was not competent to make executive decisions. "Interesting suggestion," I replied calmly, taking notes. "Do you think my 15 years of executive experience, including 3 companies that I took from loss to record profit, are not enough for an expansion decision based on detailed market analysis?" The discomfort was immediate. They didn't expect her to directly verbalize what they were doing. "It's not that," Jennifer said quickly. "It's just that every company has its own particularities. Particularities that I, as the only black person in the room, wouldn't be able to understand?" I asked with deadly calm. Absolute silence. Because that's exactly how it sounds when you suggest additional oversight for decisions that any CEO would make independently. Over the next few weeks, they escalated their tactics exactly as predicted. They questioned every hire he made, especially when it involved qualified black candidates. He created bureaucratic obstacles to implementing diversity policies. He began circulating rumors about his lack of industry-specific experience. But the fatal mistake came when he intercepted a private conversation Richard had with an important client. "Between us, Frank, the company is going through an experimental phase. The board felt it needed diversity in leadership, so they brought in a guy. Well, you get the picture. But don't worry, the actual operation is still in safe hands." That conversation was automatically recorded by the company's security system, completely legal and by the book. And it was exactly what I needed. The next morning, I called an emergency executive meeting. "Gentlemen, I need to discuss some serious concerns about professional conduct." Richard entered confidently, Jennifer looked relaxed, Tom was casually leafing through papers. "Over the past 2 weeks, I have documented 63 instances of behavior that constitute racial discrimination in the workplace." Their expressions changed instantly. I turned on the projector and began showing detailed slides. Slide 1. Systematic questioning of executive decisions using language that suggests incompetence based on race. "Richard, your objections to my proposals used words like too ambitious, perhaps premature, and it would be prudent to have additional guidance in 100% of cases. Comparing this to meeting minutes from the last 5 years, these phrases were never used to question decisions made by previous white CEOs. Richard turned pale. Slide 2. Deliberate creation of bureaucratic obstacles to inclusion policies. Tom, the HR department has implemented 17 new approval requirements specifically for diversity hires. Requirements that do not exist for traditional hires. Tom began to sweat visibly. Slide 3. Sabotage of external relationships through discriminatory comments about leadership. Richard, your conversation with Frank Morrison of Morrison Industries was recorded by the corporate security system. I played the full audio. The color drained from Richard's face. Jennifer covered her face with her hands. Tom simply froze. Slide 4. Coordinated pattern of behavior. Analysis of the last 2 weeks shows perfect synchronization between your actions, suggesting prior planning for systematic sabotage. I walked slowly around the room as I continued. For 15 years, I was told I needed to work twice as hard to get half the recognition. I was told I needed to be better prepared, more diplomatic, more patient with microaggressions. I stopped in front of each of his. Do you know what I discovered by being twice as well prepared? That I can document discrimination with surgical precision. Do you know what I discovered by being more diplomatic? That I can destroy careers using only facts and evidence. And do you know what I discovered by being patient? I smiled for the first time in the meeting. That racists always give themselves away when they think they're in control. Richard tried one last desperate card. Daniel, you're misinterpreting our actions. There was never any discriminatory intent. Richard, I interrupted gently, you literally told a client that the company was being run by a diversity experiment and that the real operation was in safe hands. Do you really want to try to explain how that's not explicit racial discrimination? Dead silence. Here are your options, I continued, returning to my chair. Option 1, resign today, with a letter taking responsibility for creating a hostile environment based on racial discrimination. I'll provide neutral references and you'll leave with some dignity. Jennifer swallowed hard. Option 2, you try to fight this, and I forward all this documentation to the Federal Prosecutor's Office, the Equal Opportunity Commission, and my team of lawyers specializing in corporate discrimination, plus individual lawsuits that will permanently destroy your reputations. Tom finally found his trembling voice. You can't blackmail us like this. Blackmail. I laughed genuinely. Tom, blackmail would be threatening to expose something secret. I'm offering you the chance to take responsibility for actions that I have legally documented. The difference is fundamental. I stood up and walked to the window. You thought you were dealing with just another lucky black man who would be too grateful to cause trouble. You didn't realize you were facing someone who spent 15 years preparing specifically for this moment. When I turned around, I saw 3 completely defeated people, finally realizing that they had engineered their own professional destruction with pinpoint accuracy. You have until 5 o'clock this afternoon to decide. True justice against institutional racism was just beginning. At 4:47 p.m., 3 letters of resignation arrived on my desk. Richard Blackstone, Jennifer Walsh, and Tom Bradley had chosen the minimal dignity of leaving on their own, taking responsibility for decisions that created an inappropriate corporate environment. But that was only the first victory. Over the next 6 months, I transformed Meridian Holdings from a case study in racial discrimination into a model of excellence in corporate diversity. I implemented hiring policies based solely on merit, but with processes that eliminated unconscious biases. I created mentoring programs that connected Black employees with real opportunities for growth. I set clear goals for racial representation at all levels of the hierarchy. The results spoke for themselves. In 9 months, the company's overall productivity increased by 23%. Employee turnover dropped by 45%. Job satisfaction reached historic highs. And for the first time in 30 years, Meridian Holdings appeared on Fortune magazine's list of best companies to work for. Most importantly, we hired and promoted extraordinary talent that had been systematically overlooked by previous management. Keisha Williams, whom Jennifer Walsh said didn't have the right profile to grow, became our most successful marketing director, increasing sales by 31% with groundbreaking campaigns. Marcus Johnson took over as interim CFO, implementing control systems that saved $2.3 million in the first quarter. People who had been underestimated for decades suddenly flourished when given real opportunities based on competence, not skin color. The board of directors, initially skeptical about my experimental appointment, quickly realized that diversity wasn't just morally right, it was financially smart. During a quarterly meeting, board chairman William Hayes made a comment that perfectly summed up our transformation. "Daniel, when we brought you on, some members thought it was a risky politically correct decision. Now we realize it was simply the smartest executive decision we've made in decades." But the most significant change happened on a more personal level. One afternoon, 6 months after the layoffs, I received an unexpected call. "Mr. Thompson? This is Amanda from the front desk. There's someone here who would like to speak with you. Send them up." 15 minutes later, a young black woman in her mid-20s walked into my office, nervous but determined. "Mr. Thompson, my name is Lisa Chun. I just graduated with a degree in business, and, well, I heard about the changes here at Meridian Holdings. About how he transformed the company culture." She took a deep breath before continuing. "My mother worked in corporations for 20 years. She always told me that as a black woman, I would have to be 3 times better to get half the opportunities. That I should take any job I was offered and be grateful to be there." Lisa leaned forward, her eyes shining with determination. "But after hearing your story, after seeing what happened here, I realized something different. I realized that I don't have to settle for crumbs in toxic environments. That I can look for places where my competence is truly recognized." She smiled with confidence that reminded me of myself at age 25. "I'm here to ask for an opportunity. Not for diversity, not for a quota, but because I know I can contribute significantly to a company that values real talent." At that moment, I fully understood the true impact of our transformation. We hadn't just changed a company. We had set an example that would inspire an entire generation of young black professionals to demand excellence, not tolerance. To seek opportunities based on merit, not charity. Lisa was hired, and in less than a year, she developed a market analysis system that revolutionized our investment strategy. Today, 3 years later, Meridian Holdings is nationally recognized as a leader in authentic corporate diversity. Not the kind of superficial diversity that puts black faces in token positions, but real diversity that elevates competent people regardless of their color. Richard Blackstone never landed another executive position. Jennifer Walsh works as a freelance consultant. Tom Bradley retired early at age 55. Their careers ended not because a black CEO was vindictive, but because their own discriminatory actions were documented and exposed with irrefutable accuracy. The most powerful lesson I learned on this journey was not about how to combat racism. It was about how to transform oppressive systems into opportunities for growth for everyone. Because when you remove artificial racial barriers and allow people to compete based purely on competence, the overall level of excellence rises dramatically. When you stop wasting talent because of prejudice, you discover extraordinary human resources that were there all along, just waiting for a real chance. And when you replace a culture of privilege with a culture of merit, everyone prospers. Not just the minorities who finally receive opportunities, but the organization itself, which now has access to the best talent available, regardless of racial background. The real triumph over institutional racism does not come from dramatic confrontations or personal revenge. It comes from the quiet, irrefutable demonstration that diversity, when implemented intelligently and based on real competence, simply works better. Today, when young black professionals come to me for advice on how to navigate hostile corporate environments, I say this: prepare twice as much, yes. But not out of humility or to prove you deserve to be there. Prepare twice as much so that when racism inevitably rears its head, you have the tools to turn it into the very weapon of your justice. If this story of transformation and overcoming adversity touched your heart and inspired you to never accept less than you deserve, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because when we decide not only to survive racism, but to use it as a catalyst for positive systemic change, we create legacies that inspire entire generations. Institutional racism only remains strong when its victims accept to remain victims. When they decide to become agents of change, the game changes completely. And usually, the results are much more epic than any racist ever imagined possible.